There's a kingdom most people will never hear about in school, a place where Africa's first known class-based society emerged, where kings lived on hilltops and commoners worked the valleys below. This was a civilization with advanced metallurgy, skilled craftsmen who worked gold, iron, and copper with precision that rivaled their contemporaries anywhere in the world. They traded gold across vast distances, connecting southern Africa to Arabia, India, and even China. Their wealth flowed along routes that spanned thousands of miles. Yet if you open most history textbooks, you'll find barely a paragraph, sometimes just a footnote. When Mapungubwe is mentioned at all, it's treated as a precursor, a stepping stone to something else, never as a civilization in its own right. But here's what they don't tell you. Mapungubwe wasn't forgotten by accident. It was overwritten. Let's rewind the clock. Not decades, not a few centuries. We're going back almost 1,000 years. Around 1075 CE, while Norman knights were conquering England and the Song dynasty was flourishing in China, something extraordinary was happening in southern Africa. A kingdom was rising. Mapungubwe. And this wasn't a scattered collection of villages. This was a sophisticated, stratified society with a political structure that would define the region for centuries. At the top of Mapungubwe Hill lived the sacred king and his royal elite. Below them, in carefully organized districts, lived the merchants, craftsmen, and farmers. This was Africa's first known class-based society, a hierarchy written into the very landscape. The king wasn't just a political leader, he was sacred and untouchable. He controlled the rain, the harvests, the prosperity of the people. His power was absolute, backed by divine authority. But spiritual authority alone doesn't build an empire. Mapungubwe had something else, something that would make it a cornerstone of international trade. Gold. Gold from Mapungubwe traveled to Swahili trading ports on the coast. From there, it sailed to Arabia, Persia, India, and beyond. In return came glass beads from Egypt, ceramics from China, seashells from the Indian Ocean. Gold from Mapungubwe has been found thousands of miles away. This wasn't isolated Africa. This was a kingdom plugged into global networks of power and wealth, and they built to last. Stone terraces, defensive walls, complex urban planning that shows sophisticated knowledge of architecture and resource management. These weren't temporary settlements. This was permanence. This was civilization in every sense of the word. By the early 1200s, Mapungubwe was the regional superpower, a kingdom of perhaps 5,000 people at its peak, a center of trade, culture, and political authority that influenced everything around it. But its name would later be removed from the center of African history, pushed to the margins, reduced to a footnote, stripped of its complexity and power. And then, suddenly, Mapungubwe stopped being described as a kingdom at all. When archaeologists first started digging into Mapungubwe in the early 20th century, they found something that didn't fit the story they'd been told about Africa. The evidence was undeniable. Stratified burials, sophisticated trade networks, organized labor, centralized authority. Everything pointed to one conclusion: state-level society. A kingdom with all the characteristics that define advanced civilizations. But that's not what the early historians wrote. Primitive settlement, tribal pastoralists, simple people with no political organization. The soil told one story. The historians told another. Here's where it gets strange. There's no evidence of a gradual decline, no records of invasion, no catastrophic event that would explain why such a powerful kingdom simply vanished. When civilizations fall, they leave traces: wars, migrations, environmental collapse, something. But with Mapungubwe, there's just silence. Then, in 1933, something happened that should have changed everything. A local informant led a team to a royal burial site. What they found was extraordinary: gold artifacts, elaborate grave goods, the burial of a king, the famous golden rhinoceros, one of the most iconic artifacts in African archaeology. The discovery made headlines. For a brief moment, Mapungubwe entered public consciousness, and then it was downplayed. Behind closed doors, colonial-era scholars faced a problem. They had undeniable evidence of an advanced African civilization, but they also had an ideology that said such things weren't supposed to exist. A debate began. How should Mapungubwe be classified? Was it a kingdom, a state, a civilization, or was it something lesser, something that could be safely ignored? That classification would decide whether Mapungubwe entered history or disappeared from it. The evidence was in, the verdict was decided. But something strange started happening in the academic literature. The same archaeological site, the same artifacts, the same structures. But the words changed. Kingdom became site. Rulers became chiefs. State became culture. These aren't just synonyms. These are fundamentally different classifications. A kingdom has legitimacy. A site is just a location. A ruler has authority and sovereignty. A chief sounds temporary, tribal, less sophisticated. One by one, scholarly works began adopting this new language. Mapungubwe was being linguistically downgraded in real time. But here's where it gets really revealing. Let's compare Mapungubwe to its European contemporaries from the same period. Medieval European kingdoms from the 11th and 12th centuries, some with similar population sizes, similar economic structures, similar political hierarchies. How are they described? Kingdoms. On states, dynasties, monarchies, words that carry weight, words that imply civilization. Mapungubwe, with its stone architecture, international trade networks, and stratified society. Chiefdom, settlement, culture. The evidence never changed, only the labels did. This wasn't an accident. This was a systematic rebranding. A linguistic strategy that allowed scholars to acknowledge Mapungubwe's existence while simultaneously diminishing its significance. By changing the vocabulary, they changed the perception. They created a category specifically designed to keep African achievements in a separate, lesser tier. The double standard was everywhere. European medieval societies were studied as history. African medieval societies were studied as anthropology. Same level of complexity, different vocabulary, different respect. But here's the thing about evidence. It doesn't care what you call it. The artifacts remained, the trade goods remained, the structures remained. You could call it whatever you wanted, but you couldn't make it less real. Language alone couldn't erase Mapungubwe. Something even more powerful had to be altered. Maps tell stories. They decide what matters and what doesn't, what's central and what's peripheral. In the early days of Southern African archaeology, maps showed Mapungubwe exactly where it belonged, at the center of a regional power structure that lasted nearly 150 years. The sequence was clear. Mapungubwe came first. It established the patterns of trade, political organization, and sacred kingship that Great Zimbabwe would later inherit and expand. They were part of the same story. Connected. A lineage of African state building. But then, something shifted. Look at the later maps. Great Zimbabwe explodes in size and importance. Detailed illustrations, extensive descriptions, the unquestioned center of attention. Mapungubwe reduced to a dot, sometimes a brief mention, sometimes not there at all. The same pattern repeated in atlases, textbooks, museum displays. Great Zimbabwe became the Great One. Mapungubwe became the footnote. Now, Great Zimbabwe is extraordinary. Its stone walls are architectural marvels. Its scale is breathtaking. This isn't about diminishing Great Zimbabwe. This is about asking, why erase the foundation to celebrate the successor? Because there was a problem. Great Zimbabwe was too big to ignore, too impressive to dismiss. By the time European colonizers arrived, its ruins were already legendary. Colonial scholars spent decades trying to prove Great Zimbabwe was built by anyone other than black Africans, Phoenicians, Arabs, lost white tribes, every theory except the obvious one. But the evidence eventually became overwhelming. Great Zimbabwe was undeniably African, so they had to accept it, reluctantly, grudgingly. But they accepted it. But Mapungubwe presented a different problem. Mapungubwe was older. It predated any possible Arab or European influence. It emerged entirely from indigenous African development. If you admitted Mapungubwe was a sophisticated kingdom, you admitted that African state building was indigenous. homegrown, not borrowed, not influenced from outside. Great Zimbabwe could be explained away. Maybe Arab traders influenced it. Maybe there was external contact. But Mapungubwe? And there was no one to credit but Africans themselves. So, a choice was made. Not explicitly, not in some sinister conspiracy, but through 1,000 small editorial decisions by cartographers, historians, and educators. One African state would be remembered as the Great One. The other would quietly fade. And once the maps were changed, the people themselves became the next target. History isn't just written in soil and stone, it lives in people. In the stories grandmothers tell grandchildren, in the names families carry, in the memories passed down through generations, the descendants of Mapungubwe didn't forget. For centuries after the kingdom fell, they remembered. They remembered kings who lived on sacred hills. They remembered gold that flowed to distant lands. They remembered when their ancestors commanded rain and ruled the valleys. Then came the colonial administrators with their clipboards and categories. Southern Africa was carved into neat boxes, ethnic groups, tribal homelands, each community assigned a label, a territory, a simplified history. The descendants of Mapungubwe were scattered across these new classifications, absorbed, redistributed, reclassified. The complex reality, centuries of migration, intermarriage, cultural exchange, was flattened into fixed identities that often had more to do with colonial convenience than historical truth. When elders tried to tell their stories, they were met with skepticism. Oral histories were dismissed as myth, legends, superstition, not real evidence. These people have no written records, the scholars said, no reliable history. Then they confuse myth with reality. Never mind that oral traditions had preserved accurate information for centuries. Never mind that these same scholars accepted oral traditions from European societies without question. Homer's Iliad, historical value, African griots, just storytellers. But the cruelest cut was what happened to the royal lineages. Families who had maintained their connection to Mapungubwe's ruling class found their genealogies questioned, their royal status denied. In official records, they became commoners, at best minor chiefs with no real historical significance. Children were taught in schools that their ancestors had built nothing, achieved nothing. That civilization came from elsewhere. Cultural memory survived only in fragments, a ceremony here, a song there, scattered pieces of a puzzle that was no longer supposed to exist. Some families kept small tokens, a golden bead passed down through generations, a story whispered only within the family. Quiet resistance against erasure. They remembered kings. History said they never existed. Imagine knowing your ancestors built something extraordinary, having the proof in your family's memory, and watching the world tell you it never happened, that you're making it up, that you're confused, that your grandmothers were liars, and if you think this was just academic oversight, just scholarly error, you haven't seen what came next, because the most devastating act of erasure was still to come. December 31st, 1932, New Year's Eve. While the world prepared to celebrate, a team of researchers descended into a royal burial site on Mapungubwe Hill. What they found would make the historical narrative impossible to maintain. Gold. Not just fragments, not just traces, an entire royal burial filled with golden artifacts. And then, the rhinoceros. 23 centimeters long, made of gold foil over a wooden core, every detail carefully rendered, the musculature, the texture of the skin, the weight of its stance. This wasn't crude metalwork. This was artistry. This was the kind of craftsmanship that required generations of skill, specialized workshops, and royal patronage. The burial contained over 300 grams of gold objects. In the 12th century, that represented extraordinary wealth, and the way it was buried told its own story. This wasn't treasure. This was regalia. Symbols of power placed with a king. Analysis of the gold revealed sophisticated metallurgical knowledge, the ability to create thin foil, to work gold at precise temperatures, to alloy it for specific purposes. This confirmed what the trade goods had already suggested. Mapungubwe wasn't just participating in international trade, they were a major supplier. Arab and Chinese records mention gold from the African interior. This was that gold. The discovery sent shockwaves through the academic world. You could downplay stone walls, you could reinterpret political structures, but you couldn't explain away a golden rhinoceros as anything other than what it was, evidence of a wealthy, sophisticated kingdom with symbolic art and sacred kingship. For a brief moment, it seemed like Mapungubwe would finally get its due. The newspapers celebrated the discovery. Museums clamored to display the artifacts. Behind the scenes, some scholars began pushing for a formal revision. Mapungubwe needed to be reclassified, upgraded from settlement to kingdom, from culture to state. Official requests were made, detailed arguments presented. The evidence was undeniable. Surely now, with proof this tangible, this beautiful history would be rewritten. The requests went to committees, to boards, to government officials and university administrators. And then, the responses came back. The response revealed why Mapungubwe would never fully return to the textbooks. The responses were polite, professional, filled with academic jargon and procedural objections. Insufficient evidence for definitive conclusions. Requires further comparative study. Premature to fundamentally reclassify. This, next to a golden rhinoceros. But this was never really about academic standards. This was about something far more valuable than gold. Land. The story European colonizers told themselves, and the world, was simple. They'd found an empty land, a wilderness, maybe some scattered primitive tribes, but nothing that could be called civilization. Empty land could be claimed. Empty land had no prior owners. Empty land was yours for the taking. Mapungubwe shattered that story. Here was proof of organized society, political structures, property ownership, land cultivation, everything that under European law established legitimate claims to territory. Colonial law had a concept, terra nullius, land belonging to no one, land that could be legally claimed because it had no civilized inhabitants, a kingdom that had traded internationally for centuries, that had organized labor, wealth distribution, political hierarchy. That wasn't terra nullius. That was somebody's country. And if Mapungubwe was a legitimate kingdom, then its descendants had legitimate claims, not just moral claims, legal ones, that couldn't be allowed. But there was another threat, even more fundamental. The entire ideological structure of apartheid and colonialism before it rested on a simple premise: European superiority. The civilizing mission. The idea that white colonizers brought civilization to a dark, backward continent. Mapungubwe didn't just challenge that narrative, it demolished it. Here was an African kingdom achieving state-level organization, international trade, and sophisticated metallurgy during the same period when European knights were fighting over feudal territories. No European contact, no Arab masters, no outside influence to credit. Just Africans building their own civilization. And this is where the academic gatekeeping became crucial. It wasn't enough to simply ignore Mapungubwe. The evidence was too strong, the artifacts too spectacular. So instead, it had to be redefined, downgraded, classified in ways that made it seem less threatening, less legitimate, less civilized. And who controlled those classifications? Who decided what counted as state-level society? Who set the standards? The very people who had the most to lose if those standards were applied equally. Mapungubwe didn't just challenge history. It challenged ownership. It challenged the entire justification for dispossession. So it had to disappear. Not completely. That was impossible. But enough. Quietly enough. Consistently enough. The artifacts could be locked in storage, the site could be downplayed, the textbooks could maintain their silence. But something survived every attempt to erase it. The 1990s brought something colonial scholars never anticipated: freedom. When apartheid fell, so did some of the barriers protecting the old narratives. A new generation of scholars, many of them African, returned to Mapungubwe with fresh eyes and better tools. Ground-penetrating radar, advanced dating techniques, comprehensive surveys that colonial-era archaeologists never attempted or never wanted to attempt. And the evidence kept mounting. New excavations revealed Mapungubwe was larger than previously claimed, more complex, more organized. The population estimates doubled, the extent of trade tripled, the sophistication of urban planning revolutionary. Papers were published, conferences held. Quietly, without fanfare, the academic consensus began to shift. The terminology started changing back, in scholarly circles at least. In 2003, Mapungubwe was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Official recognition, finally, of its significance. The golden rhinoceros emerged from storage. Museum exhibits were redesigned. The story was being told again. University textbooks quietly added paragraphs, then pages. Some even dedicated entire chapters. But here's what didn't change: school curricula, global education standards. To popular historical consciousness, ask a random person on the street about ancient African kingdoms. They might mention Egypt, maybe Mali if they're well-read. Mapungubwe? Blank stares. Where are the blockbuster documentaries, the popular history books, the cultural presence that kingdoms of equivalent significance enjoy? The academic record may be correcting itself, but the popular narrative? Still frozen in the colonial version. Millions of students graduate without ever hearing the name, without knowing that Africa had sophisticated states before European contact, without understanding that civilization emerged independently on every inhabited continent. Even when people visit the museum, many walk right past. No context, no fanfare, just another artifact among thousands. Think about how the world responded to other archaeological discoveries: Machu Picchu, Angkor Wat, Petra. They became global phenomena, symbols of human achievement, sources of national pride. Mapungubwe got a UNESCO plaque. The academic corrections exist, hidden in journals most people will never read, presented at conferences most people will never attend. But the systems that shape what billions of people learn, those turn slowly. Very slowly. Some would say they're just being cautious, waiting for absolute certainty. Others would ask, how much more evidence do you need? And once you understand what happened to Mapungubwe, you begin to see the pattern. Mapungubwe isn't special, not because it wasn't remarkable, it was, but because what happened to it wasn't unique. Look around, just in southern Africa alone. Thulamala, another stone-walled settlement, sophisticated goldwork, royal burials, dating back centuries. How much have you heard about it? The precursor to Mapungubwe itself, evidence of early state formation, long-distance trade, social stratification, mentioned in academic papers, invisible everywhere else. Expand the view, if, in what's now Nigeria. Bronze, casting that rivals anything produced in Renaissance Europe. Naturalistic sculptures from the 12th century that stunned Western art historians. When these were first discovered, scholars insisted they must have been made by Portuguese visitors. The idea that Africans could produce such art was literally unthinkable to them. Science proved otherwise. The silence adjusted, but remained. Geno, one of sub-Saharan Africa's oldest known cities. It's occupied from 250 BCE to 1400 CE. Major trade center, ironworking, urban planning. Ask someone to name an ancient African city. They'll say Timbuktu if you're lucky. Geno, never heard of it. The Swahili city-states, Kilwa, Mombasa, Gedi. Stone cities with multi-story buildings, indoor plumbing, international trade from China to Arabia. Thriving from the 9th to the 16th centuries, some of the most sophisticated urban centers of the medieval world. Chinese porcelain in their markets, African gold in Asian treasuries, footnotes, all of them. You start to notice a pattern. Every site that proves indigenous African complexity, sophistication, and state building gets the same treatment: downgraded, reclassified, minimized, while sites of similar or lesser significance in Europe, Asia, or the Americas receive global recognition, museum exhibitions, popular documentaries. This wasn't about Mapungubwe. This was a template, a systematic approach to controlling history, to deciding what counts as civilization, to determining whose achievements matter. And it worked. Generations have graduated believing Africa had no history worth studying before European arrival. That complexity came from outside. That civilization was imported. The evidence was always there. Buried, yes, but there. And slowly, painstakingly, it's being recovered. New scholars are telling these stories. New museums are being built. New curricula are being written. Descendants are reclaiming their histories, standing on the hills their ancestors built and saying, "We remember." But here's the question that should haunt us. If Mapungubwe, with its gold, its stone walls, its undeniable evidence, could be erased this cleanly from global consciousness, how many others were never allowed to exist at all? How many kingdoms lie beneath the soil, waiting to challenge everything we've been taught? And who decides when it's time to dig?